sides parallel. So if you see opposite sides parallel, it's a parallelogram. These arrows mean that these sides are parallel. A rhombus has 4 congruent sides. So if you see 4 congruent sides, that's a rhombus. A rectangle has 4 right angles. So if you see a shape that has 4 right angles, you should say rectangle. Now, I've written square here off to the side because a square is a rhombus and a rectangle at the same time. So a square has to have 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So if you see a shape that has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles, you're going to say square. A kite has 2 pairs of congruent sides that are consecutive, meaning they are touching. So if you see a pair of congruent sides and then another pair of congruent sides that are touching, that's a kite. A trapezoid has 1 pair of parallel sides. So if you have 1 pair of parallel sides, that is a trapezoid. Okay? Now the last one isn't really its own brand new shape. It's a special case. If you have a trapezoid that has congruent legs, it's called an isosceles trapezoid. So the parallel sides are called bases. The non-parallel sides are called legs. So if you see a trapezoid, you know, the 1 pair of sides parallel, look at the non-parallel sides. If they are not congruent, then it's just a regular trapezoid. But if the non-parallel sides are congruent, then it's an isosceles trapezoid. So let's practice what I just said. Now I know all of these shapes look like squares, but we're not going to go by the look of these shapes. We're going to go by the markings on here. So for example, shape A, we have 1 pair of parallel sides, and then the non-parallel sides are congruent. That makes this an isosceles trapezoid. Okay, I'm going to cross that off the list. Let's see, what else? For shape B has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. That makes this a square. All right, shape C just has 1 pair of parallel sides. That's all we know. We don't know anything about the non-parallel sides, but 1 pair of parallel sides makes this a trapezoid. Okay, I forgot to cross off square, and now trapezoid. Now for shape D, we have 2 pairs of congruent sides, which are touching. All right, we have a pair of congruent sides over here and another pair over here. That makes this a kite. Whoops. All right, 2 pairs of consecutive sides congruent. Now for shape E, we have 4 congruent sides. That makes this a rhombus. Shape F has 4 right angles. That makes this a rectangle. And shape G has opposite sides parallel, all right? 2 pairs of opposite sides parallel. That makes this a parallelogram. Okay, now it's time to talk about some of the properties. All right, I guess I said I was going to do this in another video, but I was wrong. It's happening right now. So for each shape, put a check mark in a box for a property that must be true. The first row has been done for us. Okay, so look, the bottom line is we really need to memorize the information that's on this chart, especially the part about diagonals. All right, so when it comes to parallelograms, the diagonals bisect each other. So definitely memorize that. When it comes to a rhombus, the diagonals are perpendicular. Make sure you memorize that the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. Now also, for a rhombus, the diagonals are lines of symmetry. All right, in other words, they are angle bisectors. So look, I keep saying the word diagonal. So this is a diagonal, okay, and this is another diagonal. So they are perpendicular, and they are lines of symmetry. So that means like the two angles are equal on either side. Now, for a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. All right, so any of these properties that mention diagonals, you need to definitely memorize those. All right, so that means this and this. All right, those two diagonals are congruent. For a kite, again, the diagonals are perpendicular, so you need to memorize this. All right, so for a kite, we've got this is a diagonal, and this is a diagonal, and these will be perpendicular. All right, if you have an isosceles trapezoid, the diagonals are congruent. So like boom and boom. All right, those should be the same. All right, so there's another one. So a lot of these properties, let me zoom out for a second. See all of these, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 properties that have to do with diagonals. In addition to the definitions, you need to memorize the properties that, at least the ones that pertain to diagonals. Okay, so a square has, what do we know about the diagonals of a square? The diagonals are congruent, they are perpendicular, and they bisect each other. Let's look back at our chart. Okay, they are congruent, because a square is all of these. So congruent, they are perpendicular, and they bisect each other. Okay, the part about bisecting each other is because, all right, remember that everything on the left side of the page is a parallelogram. So a rhombus is a parallelogram, a rectangle is a parallelogram, and a square is a parallelogram. So this one property up here that says diagonals bisect each other, sure, that applies to a parallelogram, but that's going to apply to rhombus, rectangle, and square as well. So a square really has 4 properties to the diagonals. All right, we have perpendicular, congruent, and they bisect each other. And there's another one that they didn't mention about the being angle bisectors. All right, but that could have been there as well. But out of the ones that we have here, there you go. Now, none of these have diagonals parallel. So this entire column you can just ignore. All right, none of these are going to be it. All right, so we're just talking about congruent, perpendicular, and the diagonals bisect each other. That's it. Okay, so let's do rectangle. So let's see, a rectangle. All right, let's pretend that we have this chart memorized. A rectangle, the diagonals are congruent, and we have the parallelogram one. The diagonals bisect each other. So that's it. The diagonals bisect each other, and the diagonals are congruent. All right, but you have to memorize that. So diagonals congruent, diagonals bisect each other. Okay, how about a rhombus? Okay, a rhombus, I remember that the diagonals are perpendicular. Okay, so let's look back. So see, the diagonals are perpendicular, but also a rhombus is a parallelogram, so the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so we will not have the diagonals are congruent. That will not be checked. How about parallelogram? Well, parallelogram just has the one. Diagonals bisect each other. That's it. Whoops. Okay, so diagonals bisect each other. Boom. How about a kite? Now, a kite is not a parallelogram, so we're not going to have the whole diagonals bisecting each other deal. Okay, that's just for parallelograms. But for a kite, we need to memorize that the diagonals are perpendicular. All right, so that's the one we're going to have. So for the kite, the diagonals are perpendicular. They're not congruent and they don't bisect each other. Okay, how about a trapezoid? Now, a trapezoid was the one shape that didn't have any properties for the diagonals. Nothing. Okay, until we get to isosceles trapezoid. So for trapezoid, it's all blank. All right, and then isosceles trapezoid, we're back to diagonals are congruent. All right, I've seen that before. So that's true for a rectangle, and it's also true for an isosceles trapezoid. Diagonals are congruent. But that's it. Okay, trapezoid had nothing. Isosceles trapezoid, the diagonals are congruent. All right, so I'm going to erase this giant X here. So that's how we can sort of classify the properties of the 7 special quadrilaterals.